September 14th, 1939. The Atlantic Ocean churned gray and violent beneath a sky heavy with war clouds. In those dark waters, a German submarine, U-39, descended into silence, its crew tense, their hands steady on cold metal controls. They had been hunting British ships, doing their duty for the fatherland. But on this day, just 11 days after Britain declared war on Germany, they would become prisoners instead of hunters. The depth charges exploded around them with thunderous violence. The submarine shuddered. Water began seeping through compromised seals. Captain Gerhard Glattes, a career naval officer who had served his country with distinction, gave the order that no captain wants to give: surface, surrender. As the crew emerged from the disabled submarine into the cold Atlantic air, they faced British warships with their guns trained upon them. These young German sailors, some barely 20 years old, stood on the deck with their hands raised, salt spray mixing with the taste of defeat on their lips. They had been told stories about the British, stories about their ruthlessness, their cold efficiency, their hatred for Germans. They expected rough treatment, perhaps violence, maybe worse. What they could not have known as they were hauled aboard British vessels that day was that they were about to experience something completely unexpected, something that would challenge everything they had been taught about their enemies. They were about to discover that the British had a weapon far more powerful than guns and bombs, a weapon called civility. Captain Glattes would spend the next 7.5 years in British captivity. 7.5 years that would transform him in ways he never imagined. But on that September day in 1939, as he stood dripping on the deck of a British warship, surrounded by men whose language he barely understood, all he could feel was fear and uncertainty about what would come next. The war was just beginning, and for hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who would follow in Captain Glatt's footsteps into British captivity, they would all share the same expectation. They anticipated hatred, brutality, and revenge. They had been conditioned by Nazi propaganda to believe that the British were monsters who would show no mercy to captured Germans. They were wrong. The early months of the war saw relatively few German prisoners on British soil. Most were, like Captain Glatt's, U-boat crews plucked from the sea or Luftwaffe pilots shot down over England during air raids. The British government, facing the very real threat of a German invasion, initially had no intention of keeping these prisoners close. They were quickly shipped across the Atlantic to Canada, far from the fighting, far from any possibility of escape or rescue. 2 camps were hastily established in Britain. The first, Grizedale Hall in Lancashire, was a magnificent 40-room mansion that would become known, with typical British understatement, as the U-boat Hotel. It was reserved for officers. In November 1939, just 2 months into the war, it housed only 21 men. The second camp, Glen Mill in Oldham, was a converted cotton mill that held 2,000 men of lower ranks. These prisoners lived in a state of suspended animation, caught between two worlds. They were no longer soldiers, but not quite civilians either. They wore their uniforms with the insignia removed. They saluted their own officers according to military protocol. They waited, uncertain of their fate, in a country that was supposed to be their mortal enemy. The transformation came gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape shrouded in fog. It began with small things. Tea, for instance. The British are famous for their tea, and they offered it to their prisoners. Hot, sweet tea in proper cups. Not thrown at them, not forced down their throats, but offered. Would you like some tea? It seemed absurd. They were at war, and their captors were offering them tea as if they were guests who had dropped by for a visit. Then there was the food. The Geneva Convention stipulated that prisoners of war should receive the same rations as the ground troops of their captors. The British, despite their own rationing and shortages, followed this rule meticulously. The German prisoners ate the same meals as British soldiers. Sometimes, remarkably, they ate better than they had in the German military, where supply lines were often stretched thin. But it went beyond mere compliance with international law. There was something in the British character, a deep-seated sense of fair play that manifested in countless small courtesies: guards who said please and thank you, officers who treated their prisoners with dignity rather than contempt, a system that while strict, was fundamentally humane. The German prisoners, raised on Nazi propaganda that portrayed the British as cruel and vindictive enemies, found themselves profoundly confused. Where was the hatred they had been promised? Where were the beatings, the deliberate cruelty, the vengeful punishments? It didn't make sense. The war changed everything in 1942 and 1943. The tide was turning. In North Africa, British and American forces launched a massive campaign against the combined German and Italian forces. When the Axis armies finally surrendered in May 1943, the Allies suddenly found themselves responsible for approximately 260,000 prisoners of war. Half were German, half Italian. This was when the real influx began. Ships arrived in British ports carrying thousands upon thousands of young German men, sunburned from the African desert, tired from fighting, uncertain about their futures. They disembarked in a country that many had hoped to conquer but had never seen. Rain instead of sand, green fields instead of barren wastes, and people who spoke a language they didn't understand, looking at them with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion to, surprisingly often, something that looked almost like pity. The British government faced a dilemma. They needed workers. The war had drained Britain of able-bodied men who were fighting across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Farms were understaffed. Roads needed repair. Cities bombed by the Luftwaffe needed rebuilding. And here were hundreds of thousands of fit young men with nothing to do. The solution was pragmatic. Put them to work. But this was where something remarkable happened. Instead of treating these prisoners as slave labor, forced to toil under harsh conditions and brutal guards, the British implemented a system that was, by the standards of wartime, almost incomprehensibly fair. Prisoners were paid for their labor, not in British pounds, which could be used for escape attempts, but in camp money. They could use this to buy small luxuries, toiletries, cigarettes. They worked regular hours. They received days off. On farms throughout Britain, German prisoners worked alongside British farmers, learning the rhythm of the seasons, the careful art of coaxing crops from the soil. And something unexpected began to happen. Friendships formed. It started tentatively, awkwardly. A farmer teaching a young German how to handle sheep, communicating through gestures when words failed. A prisoner helping to fix a fence, taking pride in doing the work well. Shared cups of tea during breaks, sitting on a stone wall, looking out over rolling green hills that could have been anywhere, that for a moment didn't belong to either Germany or Britain, but simply existed, beautiful and peaceful. The prisoners began to see the British not as propaganda had portrayed them, but as they actually were. Ordinary people, worried about their sons and brothers fighting overseas, struggling with rationing and shortages, determined to maintain their way of life despite the chaos of war. People who valued politeness and civility, who believed in following the rules, who thought it was important to be fair even to their enemies. And the British, in turn, began to see the prisoners not as faceless enemies, but as individuals, young men who missed their families, who worried about loved ones in cities being bombed, who had been caught up in a war they hadn't started and couldn't control, men who laughed, who got homesick, who worked hard, and appreciated kindness. The re-education program began as the war was winding down. British officials, looking ahead to the peace, realized that simply defeating Germany militarily would not be enough. The Nazi ideology had to be confronted, challenged, dismantled. The men who had fought for Hitler needed to understand what they had been fighting for, needed to see the truth that had been hidden from them by propaganda. It was an unprecedented experiment. At special facilities throughout Britain, German prisoners attended lectures on democracy, citizenship, and human rights. They watched films, read books that had been banned in Nazi Germany, engaged in discussions with British intellectuals who came to the camps to talk with them. The centerpiece of this program was Wilton Park in Buckinghamshire, founded and run by Heinz Küppler, a German-Jewish refugee who had fled the Nazis. Küppler designed the center to feel like a residential college rather than a prison. Distinguished speakers came to lecture. Bertrand Russell, the philosopher. William Beveridge, architect of the British welfare state. Nancy Astor, the first woman to serve in the British Parliament. But the most powerful part of the re-education program was not the lectures or discussions. It was a film. Every single German prisoner was required to watch it, no exceptions. The film showed the liberation of Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald concentration camps, the skeletal prisoners, more dead than alive. The mass graves, the gas chambers, the systematic industrial machinery of extermination that the Nazi regime had built. Many of the German prisoners refused to believe what they were seeing. It had to be propaganda, they said. British lies designed to make Germany look evil. This couldn't have happened. Not in their country, not by their government. But as more evidence emerged, as the full horror of the Holocaust became undeniable, something broke inside many of these men. They had fought for that regime. They had believed in it, and it had perpetrated unimaginable evil. The reactions varied. Some prisoners retreated into denial. Some became angry, insisting they had known nothing about it, that they had just been soldiers doing their duty. Some were overcome with shame and grief, and some, a significant number, began to genuinely reconsider everything they had believed. The re-education program published a newspaper called Die Wochenpost, written by the prisoners themselves. It discussed politics, culture, philosophy. It debated the meaning of democracy and freedom. It was, in its way, revolutionary. These men who had grown up knowing nothing but Nazi indoctrination were now freely discussing ideas, challenging beliefs, thinking for themselves. By 1946, the war had been over for more than a year, but Britain still held over 400,000 German prisoners. The British public was growing uncomfortable with this. In newspapers and in Parliament, voices were raised questioning the morality of keeping so many men in captivity when the fighting had ended. Victor Gollancz, a publisher and activist, led a campaign called Save Europe Now, arguing that it was hypocritical for Britain to preach democracy and human rights while indefinitely detaining prisoners of war. Members of Parliament echoed this concern. How could Britain claim moral authority in Europe if it didn't practice what it preached? But there were practical considerations. Britain was desperately short of labor. The country needed to rebuild. Farms needed workers. And, frankly, many of the German prisoners didn't want to go home. Some had homes in what was now the Soviet-controlled eastern zone of Germany. They had heard stories about Soviet camps, about the harsh treatment of returning German soldiers. They wanted no part of that. Some had fallen in love with British women. Some had simply built new lives in Britain and didn't want to leave them behind. Christmas 1946 marked a turning point. The British government, responding to public pressure, relaxed the fraternization rules. For the first time, German prisoners were allowed to visit British homes during the holiday season. One prisoner, invited to spend Christmas with a British family, wrote to a local newspaper afterward, his words trembling with emotion. He described how he had not been prepared for what happened that day, how the family had treated him not as an enemy, not even as a guest, but as one of their own. Where they went, he went. What they had, he had. He was part of the family, if only for a day. These Christmas visits became widespread. All across Britain, families opened their doors to German prisoners. They shared their meager rations, their Christmas puddings, their songs and traditions. They gave these young men so far from home a taste of family and warmth and belonging. The impact was profound. Decades later, men who had been prisoners of war in Britain would speak of these Christmases with tears in their eyes. It had changed them, they said. It had shown them a different way of being, a different vision of what society could be. The prisoners worked throughout Britain, leaving their marks in ways both large and small. They swept up debris after VE Day celebrations. They helped build Wembley Way for the 1948 Olympics. They repaired roads, built houses, harvested crops. In the forest of Dean in Gloucestershire, Italian prisoners formed a football team that played in the local league. Local fans came to watch them play, initially out of curiosity, but soon because they genuinely enjoyed the matches. The Italian prisoners had a habit of piping music across the pitch through a tannoy system, creating a festive atmosphere that delighted the British spectators. Friendships formed between the prisoners and local families. Some of these connections lasted for decades, with former prisoners returning years later to visit the families who had shown them kindness during the war. In Orkney, Italian prisoners built a chapel on Lamb Holm, transforming two Nissen huts into an ornate Catholic church. They created beauty in the midst of bleakness, art in the midst of captivity. The Italian chapel still stands today, a testament to the human need to create, to worship, to make something beautiful even in the darkest times. The German prisoners, too, left their mark. They carved wooden toys and sold them to British families. They participated in camp orchestras and theater groups, performing for both fellow prisoners and local audiences. They played football against local teams, studied in educational programs, attended church services alongside British congregations. Willy Bungart was 17 when he was captured and brought to Britain. He would spend 4 years in various British POW camps, and decades later, his daughter would say that he remembered it as an adventure. He made friends, learned skills, was treated well. He sold wooden toys to British families at Christmas. He attended church where he could trade and barter with locals. His memories were largely positive. Of course, not everything was harmonious. There were fights occasionally between prisoners and locals. Emotions ran high during wartime. Some British people resented the prisoners, particularly those who had lost loved ones to German bombs or German bullets. There were newspaper articles worrying that the prisoners were leading local young women astray, though this concern often said more about British attitudes toward women's freedom than it did about the prisoners' behavior. And not all camps were alike. Some were strict, focused on security, with minimal interaction between prisoners and civilians. Others were more relaxed, more integrated into the local community. The experience varied depending on many factors, including the classification of the prisoners. The British had developed a system of categorizing German prisoners as white, gray, or black based on their political views. Black prisoners were considered the most dangerous, the most committed Nazis. They were kept in more secure facilities, watched more carefully given fewer privileges. White prisoners, deemed to have anti-Nazi sentiments, were trusted with more freedom and responsibility. The system wasn't perfect. It relied on assessments that could be subjective, on information that could be incomplete, but it represented an attempt to recognize that not all German soldiers were the same, that individual beliefs and characters mattered. By late 1947, restrictions on the prisoners had been almost completely removed. They could leave camps unescorted, walk around the surrounding areas, visit cafes and cinemas, mix freely with civilians. Many met British women. Initially, romantic relationships were forbidden, but once that ban was lifted, 796 marriages between German prisoners and British women took place almost immediately. These were not always easy relationships. The couples faced prejudice, suspicion, and practical difficulties, but many of them lasted, built on genuine affection and shared experience. These German men and British women had chosen each other despite everything, despite war and prejudice, and all the forces that should have kept them apart. Repatriation finally began in earnest in 1947 and continued through 1948. Ships carried the prisoners back to a Germany they barely recognized. Cities lay in ruins. Families were scattered. The country was divided between occupation zones, with the Soviet zone in the east already showing signs of becoming something dark and authoritarian. Some prisoners returned to find everything they had known destroyed. Eugen Clemens, a jeweler and watchmaker from Kaiserslautern, was conscripted into the Wehrmacht late in the war. He was captured in northern France in September 1944. After his release, he returned to Germany in January 1948, hoping to resume his life. Instead, he found devastation. His parents had perished in the camps. His siblings were missing. His home and business had been destroyed by Allied bombing. The Germany he had known no longer existed. He returned to Britain and married Joan, a member of the Auxiliary Territorial Service at Newbury Registry Office in 1949. He made a new life in a country that had once been his enemy but had become his home. Clemens was not alone. Approximately 25,000 German prisoners chose to stay in Britain permanently. They applied to have their prisoner status changed, becoming displaced persons and eventually British citizens. They worked, raised families, integrated into British society. They formed associations, German clubs, where they could speak their native language, share memories, maintain connections to the culture they had left behind while embracing the culture they had adopted. In Berkshire, former prisoners formed a group called the German Association. They met in each other's homes at first, then in churches and village halls as their numbers grew. They came from all over the home counties. These men who had once been enemies, now neighbors and friends. Some became pillars of their communities. Heinz Heimsoth's family still runs Thatcham Glass. Bruno Sornoff developed housing estates. Herbert Rain opened a barber shop. These were men who had fought for Germany, been captured by Britain, and then chose to build their futures in the country that had defeated them. Why did they stay? The reasons varied. Some feared returning to homes now in the Soviet zone. Some had married British women and wanted to stay with their wives and new families. Some had simply grown to love Britain, to appreciate its values and way of life. And some couldn't face returning to a Germany that bore responsibility for such terrible crime. The contrast with other prisoner experiences during World War II is striking. In Soviet hands, German prisoners faced brutal treatment, forced labor in harsh conditions, starvation, and neglect. Millions of Soviet prisoners held by Germany faced even worse, subjected to deliberate extermination policies that resulted in the deaths of approximately 3 million men. In Japanese camps, Allied prisoners suffered appalling cruelty, torture, and death rates that were 7 to 8 times higher than in German camps. The British treatment of German prisoners was not perfect. There were harsh moments, particularly in the camps hastily established in Belgium right after the war, where conditions were described as horrific. When government officials inspected these facilities, they were filled with horror at what they found. The camps were quickly closed and the prisoners transferred to Britain. But overall, the British approach was characterized by a fundamental commitment to human dignity. They followed the Geneva Convention not just in letter, but in spirit. They believed that how they treated their enemies said something important about who they were as a people, about the values they were fighting to preserve. This approach had critics. Some argued it was too soft, that enemies should be treated more harshly. Others pointed out the hypocrisy of keeping prisoners for years after the war ended, using them as labor while preaching democracy. These were valid criticisms, tensions inherent in the situation. But for the prisoners themselves, the experience was often transformative. They had expected hatred and found civility. They had expected brutality and found fairness. They had expected to be treated as monsters and instead were treated as human beings. This doesn't mean the experience was easy. These men had been torn from their homes, had endured combat, had survived the trauma of capture. They lived in camps, subject to rules and restrictions, separated from their families for years. They worried about loved ones in a Germany being bombed and then occupied. They struggled with shame and guilt as the truth about Nazi crimes emerged. They faced an uncertain future, not knowing when or if they would ever go home. But within that difficult situation, they encountered something they hadn't expected. They encountered kindness, not universal, not consistent, but real and meaningful. British farmers who treated them with respect, families who invited them to Christmas dinner, guards who saw them as individuals rather than enemies. A system that, while imperfect, tried to be fair. One prisoner described his experience in a letter that captured this paradox. He had been prepared for the worst, he wrote. He had expected cold hatred from the British, perhaps violence, certainly harsh treatment. What he found instead challenged everything he thought he knew. Tea offered with genuine politeness. Work that was difficult but not crushing. Interactions that were strictly controlled but fundamentally humane. It confused him, he admitted. It made him question the propaganda he had been fed, the beliefs he had held. The re-education program, for all its flaws and limitations, planted seeds in many minds. Exposure to banned literature, to open discussion of ideas, to democratic principles in action rather than just in theory. Some prisoners rejected all of it, clinging to Nazi ideology even in the face of overwhelming evidence of its evil. But many others began to genuinely change. They saw British democracy in action, messy and imperfect, but real. They saw a free press criticizing the government's treatment of prisoners, arguing for their rights. They saw Parliament debating their fate with members across the political spectrum, insisting that moral principles mattered, even in dealing with former enemies. They saw ordinary British people living their values, treating prisoners with basic human decency, even when it would have been easier to be cruel. These observations mattered. When these men returned to Germany, many of them carried these lessons with them. They had seen an alternative to authoritarianism, had experienced a society based on different principles. Some became active in building the new democratic Germany that emerged from the ruins of the Third Reich. The numbers tell part of the story. Over 400,000 German prisoners passed through Britain. Fewer died in British captivity than in the hands of other nations. 25,000 chose to stay permanently. 796 married British women. Tens of thousands passed through the re-education program. 170,000 worked in agriculture in 1947 alone. But numbers can't capture the human reality. They can't capture the moment when a young German prisoner, expecting hostility, was offered a cup of tea and realized his captors saw him as a person. They can't capture the Christmas dinners shared between former enemies who discovered their common humanity. They can't capture the friendships that formed over shared work in the fields, the romances that bloomed despite all barriers, the gradual transformation of men who had been taught to hate learning instead to respect and sometimes to love. There's a quote attributed to various sources about how you can judge a society by how it treats its prisoners. The British treatment of German POWs wasn't motivated by moral perfection. It was pragmatic in many ways, driven by labor needs and strategic considerations. It had flaws and failures, but it was also guided by a genuine belief that certain standards of behavior mattered, that civility and fairness were values worth upholding even toward enemies. The legacy of this experience extended far beyond the individuals involved. It became part of the narrative of post-war reconciliation between Britain and Germany. It demonstrated that even in the midst of total war, in a conflict that claimed tens of millions of lives and unleashed unprecedented horrors, there was still space for humanity. The British could have chosen differently. They could have been vengeful, brutal, deliberately cruel. Given what they knew about Nazi crimes, given the suffering inflicted on British cities by German bombs, given the deaths of British soldiers in combat against German forces, no one would have been shocked if they had chosen the path of retribution. Instead, they chose the path of civility, tea and politeness and second chances, not because they were naive or weak, but because they believed these things mattered, because they thought that how they acted in victory would define who they were more than how they fought in war. This wasn't universal. Not every British person agreed with this approach. Not every interaction between prisoners and captors was positive. War brings out both the best and worst in humanity, and all of it was present in this story. But the overall pattern, the general approach, was one of fundamental decency. The German prisoners arrived expecting one thing and found something quite different. They expected to be treated as the Nazis would have treated British prisoners, as lesser beings deserving only contempt and cruelty. Instead, they were treated according to British values, which emphasized fair play and human dignity even toward enemies. This experience challenged many of them. It forced them to confront uncomfortable questions. If the British, whom they had been taught to see as enemies, could treat them with such fundamental decency, what did that say about the regime they had fought for? If a democratic society could maintain its values even toward captured enemies, what did that suggest about the superiority of authoritarianism? Not all of them grappled with these questions. Not all of them changed their views. Human beings are complex, and years of indoctrination don't disappear because of kind treatment. But many did change. Many did recognize that they had been lied to, that there was another way to organize society, that democracy and human rights weren't just propaganda, but represented something real and valuable. When the last German prisoner left Britain in 1948, nearly a decade after Captain Glattes and his U-boat crew became the first, it marked the end of an extraordinary chapter. Hundreds of thousands of men had passed through the British POW system. They had worked British farms, rebuilt British cities, attended British churches, celebrated British holidays. They had been exposed to British culture, British values, British democracy in action. They returned to a Germany that needed to rebuild not just physically, but morally and politically. Many of them carried with them lessons learned in British captivity. They had seen that it was possible to disagree without violence, to have freedom without chaos, to maintain order while respecting individual rights. Of course, the story of post-war Germany is complex, shaped by many factors beyond the experiences of former POWs. The Marshall Plan, the occupation policies of the Allies, the Cold War division of Germany, the Nuremberg trials, the slow, painful reckoning with the Holocaust, all these things played crucial roles. But among the many influences shaping the new Germany, the experiences of men who had been prisoners in Britain were part of the mix. The prisoners who stayed in Britain, the 25,000 who chose to make their lives in what had been enemy territory, represent perhaps the most powerful statement of all. They voted with their feet, choosing to remain in a country that had defeated their homeland, a country whose values and way of life they had come to appreciate more than the Germany they left behind. Their children and grandchildren are British now, part of the fabric of British society. The German surnames in British phone books, the families with connections to both countries, the stories passed down of grandfathers who were prisoners of war, all of these are threads in the larger tapestry of British history. Today, when you visit sites like the Italian Chapel in Orkney or Eden Camp in Yorkshire, you can see physical reminders of this period. But the real legacy isn't in buildings or monuments. It's in the demonstration that even in the darkest times, even in the midst of a war that brought out the worst of human nature, there was still room for decency. The story of German POWs in Britain is ultimately a story about choices. The British could have chosen revenge, and no one would have blamed them. The prisoners could have remained hardened Nazis, and it would have been understandable given their indoctrination. Instead, many on both sides chose differently. They chose to see each other as human beings. They chose civility over cruelty, understanding over hatred, second chances over condemnation. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't universal. But it happened, and it mattered. In a war defined by unprecedented horror and inhumanity, in a conflict that claimed tens of millions of lives and featured systematic industrialized extermination, this story stands as evidence that humanity persisted, that even enemies could treat each other with basic decency, that values like fairness and dignity could survive even total war. The German soldiers who boarded ships to Britain in 1944 and 1945 were terrified. They had been raised on propaganda that portrayed the British as cruel enemies who would show no mercy. They expected brutality. They expected suffering. They expected hatred. What they found instead was tea, politeness, fair treatment, and eventually for many of them, friendship, love, and second chances at life. This unexpected experience didn't erase the war or excuse the crimes committed by the Nazi regime. It didn't make up for the millions who died or the incalculable suffering inflicted, but it did demonstrate something important about human nature and human society. It showed that even in the worst circumstances, people can choose to act with decency, that values matter even when they're difficult to maintain, that how we treat those in our power says something fundamental about who we are. The tea, the politeness, the second chances, these weren't grand gestures or dramatic acts of heroism. They were small, everyday acts of basic human decency multiplied across hundreds of thousands of interactions over nearly a decade. But their cumulative impact was profound. They changed lives, challenged beliefs, planted seeds that grew into something larger. Captain Gerhard Glattes, who spent 7.5 years as a prisoner after his submarine was captured on that September day in 1939, was finally released in April 1947. He returned to a Germany devastated by war, transformed beyond recognition. One can only imagine what he thought, looking back on those years of captivity, comparing his expectations with the reality he had experienced. Did he expect hatred? Yes. Did he find it? Sometimes, perhaps, in the eyes of those who had lost loved ones to German attacks. But more often, he found something else. He found people doing their duty but trying to be fair about it. He found a system that, while strict, respected his dignity as a human being. He found small kindnesses that accumulated over years into something significant. This is the story that doesn't get told as often as the stories of heroic resistance or dramatic battles. It's quieter, more nuanced, harder to fit into simple narratives of good and evil. But it's important precisely because of its complexity, because it shows that even in the midst of absolute war, humanity persisted. The German POWs expected cold British hatred. They found something more complicated and ultimately more powerful. They found a society trying to maintain its values even under the most difficult circumstances. They found people who believed that fairness mattered, that dignity mattered, that how you treat your enemies says something about who you are, and many of them, shaped by that experience, chose to stay. 25,000 men who could have returned to Germany instead chose to build their lives in Britain. They married British women, raised British children, became British citizens. They brought their skills, their energy, their experiences to their adopted country. They became part of Britain's story. Their legacy reminds us that even in the darkest times, there are choices. We can choose hatred or understanding. We can choose revenge or reconciliation. We can choose to see enemies as irredeemable others or as human beings who might, given the chance, surprise us. The British chose tea and politeness and second chances. It seems almost absurdly simple when you say it like that, but simple doesn't mean insignificant. Those choices mattered. They changed lives. They shaped history, and they continue to offer lessons for how we might treat those we consider enemies, how we might maintain our values even when it's difficult, how we might choose humanity over hatred. This is the story of German POWs in Britain, not a story of saints and sinners, but of ordinary people making choices in extraordinary circumstances. Not a story that erases the horror of war or excuses terrible crimes, but one that demonstrates that even in the midst of such horror, decency could survive. It's a story worth remembering, worth telling, worth learning from, because it reminds us that the choices we make about how we treat others, especially those in our power, especially those we have every reason to hate, these choices define us. They shape who we are and what kind of society we build. The German prisoners expected hatred. They found something better, and in that unexpected discovery, they found the possibility of transformation, redemption, and new beginnings. Not because they deserved it, but because their captors chose to uphold certain values regardless of whether they were deserved. That choice, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of interactions across nearly a decade, across more than 400 camps throughout Britain, made a difference. It planted seeds, it changed minds, it saved lives, and it stands as a testament to the power of choosing decency, even when revenge would be easier, even when hatred would be justified, even when the world gives you every reason to be cruel. In the end, that's what this story teaches us, that we always have a choice, that values matter, that how we treat our enemies defines us more surely than how we treat our friends, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't hatred or vengeance, but simple human kindness, tea, politeness, second chances. In a world at war, these seemingly small things became revolutionary acts. They challenged expectations, changed lives, and helped build a better peace. They remind us that even in the darkest times we can choose to be better than our worst impulses, to uphold our values, to recognize the humanity in those we've been taught to see as enemies. That's a lesson worth remembering today, tomorrow, and always.